Well, beginning this conversation this morning with us, is none other than Chike Ihwekwezu, who is a medical doctor and Director General of Nigeria Center for Disease Control, NCDC. He joins us virtually from Abuja. Thanks so much for joining us, Doctor, this morning, and it's good to see you again. Well, it's definitely not an enviable task you have on your hands. While we have the endemic ones, that's been our challenge over the years. There's COVID-19 right there. It must be an arduous task.
Yes, Ayo, it seems like a never-ending story. But I think one thing to note for Nigerians, we're at the beginning of the third wave of this new virus. We've gone through 1 and 2 as a country collectively. But as NCDC and with all our state government teams, we've also learned a lot over the last 18 months. So we're definitely not where we were in January, February, March, April last year. We're not even where we were in March, April this year because of what we've learned, how we've prepared. But one thing is for sure, we can't get out of this with the tools we have on the health and medical response side of things. We really need Nigerians to work with us. Nigerians have been so supportive over the last 18 months, made huge sacrifices. We wished this was over, but the reality is that it's not. This is a very strong foe, this virus. It has the ability to change, to become fitter. When we say new variants, that's exactly what is happening. The virus is adapting to humans, learning how to transmit more easily from one person to the other, adapting to our environment. So we have to keep adapting. We can't sit back and say, listen, we're tired. I wished we could, but the reality is we can't. So as the virus gains new capacity, new strength, new velocity, we have to gain more determination, more resilience, and more commitment to holding up the fight until we can get ahead of the curve. We've seen in some countries that they have been able to do this. They have a few more resources than we do. But collectively, with the spirit of Nigerians, I know we can mount yet another response to this very difficult foe that we're fighting, not just in Nigeria, but literally around the world.
Well, there's something you said, Doc, that I think I would like to, get a little more info on. When you say that, the federal, activities of the NCDC and the state EOCs have been able to learn a lot over time. I wonder what we have learned about the fact that people do not really use the MPIs, and that's, of course, why you are making that appeal. What have we learned about that one? Dr. Hikers, oh dear. I'm sure he will have him back in no time because it is interesting. There's so many other issues that he has raised, the NCDC has raised in other aspects of life, talking about cholera, dengue fever, Lassa fever, and so many others that we deal with every year. We have known that these things are always there. They're always in our faces. And what we do about them, now that's another thing altogether. Just recently, the NCDC released figures that indicate that about 816 deaths have been recorded from cholera alone within the past number of weeks, and thousands of cases, 31,000 or thereabout cases, have been recorded of that cholera alone. And we're paying so much attention to COVID-19, so one just wonders exactly how can we curtail these seemingly more deadly, concurrent, diseases that we have on our hands, as opposed to just paying attention to COVID-19, which some believe is not even looking as deadly as the ones that we have had over the years. I hope we'll be able to get Dr. Ihikwezu back now. Dr. Ihikwezu, are you with us now? Okay. We'll take a short break, maybe take one more report to see a thing or two that we may also still need to pay a little more attention to right up to now.
Officials of the African Center for Disease Control and Afreximbank hand over 177,600 doses of Johnson & Johnson COVID-19 vaccine to the federal government in Abuja. This shipment is the first tranche of the 29.8 million doses of Johnson & Johnson vaccine procured by the federal government through the African Vaccine Acquisition Trust. The WHO country representative describes the vaccine as a game changer for Nigeria as the country battles a third wave of the virus.
This pandemic still has a long way to run. Nigeria is already experiencing a third wave. The Johnson & Johnson Janssen vaccine we have today was listed for emergency use by WHO on the 12th of March. These vaccines are safe and effective and will be the game changer.
Officials of UNICEF and the African Center for Disease Control explained the rationale for choosing the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and encouraging citizens to get vaccinated.
The vaccine has a long shelf life and favorable storage condition. Last but not least, the vaccine is partly manufactured on the African continent, with finished activity taking place in South Africa. Our target is to deliver almost 50 million vaccines before the end of December.
This is the time to step up and get vaccinated, to take your responsibility. The vaccines are coming in and we must do our part.
Unlike the AstraZeneca vaccine, the Johnson & Johnson will only be deployed to hard-to-reach populations.
Because it is a one-dose effective vaccine, these doses will be focused on those who are in the hard-to-reach areas. That is to say, the riverine areas, desert communities, security compromised areas, and also the elderly.
Nigeria's COVID-19 infection rate has continued to spike in the last 3 weeks, averaging 500 new cases per day. But the government says the situation is not so bad as to warrant another lockdown yet.
Hassan Galadima, after battling to save the lives of 2 family members, finally lost the battle as the 2 young women died. He is at this graveyard to pay his last respect.
I lost my brother's wife and then my blood sister. My sister was discharged from the hospital. Then the ailment relapsed and then we had to rush her back to the hospital where she later died.
This is the graveyard in Zareku village, Miga local government area of Jigawa state, where the 8 people that died as a result of an outbreak of cholera were buried. You can easily tell the differences of the 8 graves from others because of their freshness. From the data we gathered in the primary healthcare in the community, about 268 cases have been recorded and more cases are arriving. Only 8 out of the 27 local government areas are yet to experience the outbreak of cholera, now ravaging Jigawa state. In Zareku village alone, 8 people, including children, died last Friday at a facility in the community in Miga local council area. The government is worried about the situation and is making effort to save lives, particularly of those in the hospital. So far, 5,000 cases have been recorded, out of which 100 have died.
The local government that has the highest number of these cases, as I mentioned during our last briefing, was Hadija, LG, and still remain the same. So far, so good. We are able to contain it. There is no new infection in the last 2 or 3 days. And we recorded from day 4 yesterday, we recorded there's over 100 people across the state.
Cholera is an infectious disease that causes severe watery diarrhea, which can lead to dehydration and most times death if not quickly treated. It is caused by eating food or water contaminated by a bacterium called Vibrio cholerae. And the safest way of preventing this from happening is by keeping high hygiene level. Sadiq Ilyasu, Channels Television News.
Definitely something to give attention to. We have Dr. Ihekwezu back, DG NCDC. We'll talk about that a little shortly. But before we lost that connection, you wanted to speak to us about the things that you have learned, especially, I mean, you and your team, when you talked about having learned a lot, especially in the light of the fact that people do not or seem not to be complying with the NPIs as much and as often as the authorities would expect.
Yeah, thanks, Ayo, and my apologies for that. Like I was saying, you know, we've learned a lot about the response in all ways, right? From laboratory detection to what infection prevention and control needs to happen in hospitals. We've learned about treatment, about oxygen, and all of that. But what I was ending with is that this is not something we can respond our ways out of. It really requires Nigerians to work with us like they have done so well for the last 18 months. And of course, you know, wearing a mask all the time is very difficult, right? Not congregating is very difficult. And so we've asked the leaders, so every congregation has a leader. So we've asked everyone to help us for one last push in this pandemic, right? We're beginning to get vaccines into the country. We've just announced our sister agency received 4 million doses of Moderna yesterday, another 177,000 doses of the J&J vaccine. We're expecting more of the AstraZeneca. So finally, we're getting in supplies of the tools that we need from a health perspective. But we cannot sustain this response just from the health response because we don't have enough. So we need everyone to join us for one, hopefully last push against this virus, to just hold back a little bit more, to ensure that people that they manage, that they're in control of, are able to enforce the measures that are so important to limit transmission.
But Doc, how do we convince people? How do you expect to convince people about COVID-19 when, I mean, just as you have noted, as at 1st August 2021, a total of 31,425 suspected cases of cholera, including 816 deaths, have been reported in 22 states of the nation. Oh dear. Well, hopefully we'll be able to get Dr. Ihekwezu back again. Seem to be having some tech issues with the connection from his end. We'll be back after now.
Well, indeed, while we wait to come back, while we wait for Dr. Ihekwezu to come back, I do think that the figures are a little chilling, Ayo. And when you look at the fact that this is happening in 22 states, and so far, the figures of people who have died from cholera, as Dr. Ihekwezu did point out in the briefing, which was done by the Ministry of Health yesterday at the Villa. So usually they have these periodic briefings from different agencies and parastatals of government, sometimes ministries as well. The ministers will brief State House correspondents, take questions from them on different sectors of their ministry. And I think yesterday was the turn of the Ministry of Health. We heard the Minister of Health to speak on the doctors' strike and why they will be adopting the no work, no pay rule. But when we got to listen to Dr. Ihekwezu, he was very concerned about the state of cholera in the country, which is a totally preventable disease. So it will be very interesting to know what collaboration is going on between the NCDC and also state governments, because when you look at the fact that cholera has now affected 22 states in total, and you look at some of these states, and you know, some of them you can understand because we understand what causes cholera. Some of them you can you can say, well, the chances are very high that this sort of state should be susceptible to it. For instance, Benue, that has Benue and Borno, two states that have huge populations of of internally displaced people who are living in camps, and sometimes sanitation might not be so great there. So, you know, there'll be huge questions as to, or there'll be some understanding as to what could have happened in those states. But when you see other states, for instance, the Federal Capital Territory, which has also been very affected by this cholera outbreak, you have to ask, how are we dropping the ball? You know, what measures are state governments and even federal authorities right here in the Federal Capital Territory putting in place to ensure that people have access to safe drinking water? What measures are we putting in place to ensure that we stop open defecation? You're traveling from the airport to the town, and along Airport Road, if you leave really early in the morning sometimes, the sights that you see, there are huge questions as to, you know, what have we done to ensure that we increase the number of public toilets that we have and that there is increased hygiene, which is supposed to be one of the gains that we have had from COVID-19. Ayo.
To ensure that we is with Dr. Ihekweazu, who, by the way, we have back. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Ihekweazu, and welcome back. Sincere apologies for this. So, you wanted to speak to us about some of these issues, especially around cholera. I mean, there are more fatalities, you know, from the cholera you will see within a much shorter time. It is a periodic ailment. You have told us that yourself, and one wonders, how come we have not been able to get ahead of it?
So, Ayo, yes, I hope this holds out. Cholera is really an endemic disease in Nigeria, and it is one fundamentally linked with water hygiene and sanitation. And what has happened in Nigeria over the past maybe 20 years is that we have taken our eyes off water as an important resource delivered by societies and their governments. And we have all relinquished that responsibility, even among the elite and the middle class, to individual responsibility. So we're all building our own boreholes. By doing that, we have taken away the political pressure on our leaders to focus on the provision of water as a fundamental need for the development of any society. And so when that happens, and when water reticulation systems fail, people resort to whatever local mechanisms they can to get water. Those that can afford it, dig boreholes. Those that can't, rely on rainwater and water from streams. And through that comes a waterborne disease, of which cholera is the most dangerous, right? So imagine you're fetching water from a stream. At some point in the stream, you have no idea what people have done upstream. And with open defecation happening, with the rains coming, what happens is people defecate around streams. The rain carries all that feces into the streams. Downstream, other people fetch this water, and then it starts circulating in the next community and in the next community. Cholera is a very tricky infectious disease. The reason is, it appears to be just, a little bit of diarrhea. And people don't realize how quickly individuals can deteriorate because of the rapid loss of fluids in especially younger people. So it leads to death very quickly. We start a response. We together with our partners at the state level, we mobilize oral rehydration fluids, drips, chlorination efforts. But all of that doesn't really affect the core of the problem. So my message has been, this is not a medical issue. This is really a societal issue with our government, local, state, and a little bit of federal, because the provision of water is not really a federal government responsibility at the level of our villages and cities. This is a state government responsibility, and we must refocus on this so that we can focus ourselves at NCDC at on the more difficult infectious disease, rather than every year we're going back to dealing with infections that most countries have dealt with and managed many years ago.
Well, perhaps there is a need to even decrypt the issues. For instance, on one of the documents that you sent, to us in the media, Figure 1 shows the map of Nigeria showing states with reported cholera cases, especially between week 1 and week 30 of 2021. What you will find, if you scroll, down that page, is that on page 3, for instance, we have a map, showing states reporting confirmed cases, states reporting suspected cases, and states reporting no case. This particular one, Dr. Ihekweazu. And one wonders, if you look at it, you see that most of the states affected are in the north. Is there any specific thing you've been able to find out as to why that is the case?
So, with every infectious disease, there's some geographical distribution. Right now, most of the COVID cases we find are in southern Nigeria. We recently had a monkeypox outbreak, mostly in the south. Cholera has predominated some of the northern states. And once circulation starts happening, once transmission starts happening, it spreads very quickly from state to state. So there have been states that have had regular outbreaks almost year on year. And we communicate with them directly. Some of the states in northern Nigeria, it's a factor and over-reliance on streams in certain parts of the country. So there are local circumstances in states that lead to the predominance of cholera in those states. But the issue that once transmission starts, then cholera then moves very quickly from individual to individual, because people then share not only the original source of water, which is where the infection would have come from, but they're now sharing this in communities, and it gets into the families and spreads from family to family. So the map really covers 22 out of our 36 plus 1 states in Nigeria have a cholera situation. Some are worse, some are a little bit better, but you can see that for any infection where it's so widespread in the country, really, this should be a national crisis at top of everyone's agenda on getting this right.
Well, Doc, when you're looking at this map again, a question that I ask, myself is, just as you said, this happens every year. We've always known it. So it would seem then that it is not a health problem, but maybe a political problem, if I can put it that way, because if government was able to provide the water access to people, and all of that, perhaps this wouldn't have occurred. What have you been able to find out as to why this hasn't been the case?
So I think underlying all of this, and this is a big factor in everything we do in infectious disease, is our population expansion in the last 20 years, right? Not only are we having challenges sustaining the delivery of basic amenities to the existing population of Nigeria, we are growing. We are growing at a population at a rate of 2.5 to 3% annually. Right? It means that we have to continue building up our social infrastructure to continue providing for more people. And there's nothing that people need more to survive than water. So once there's a strain on the supply of water, we have this impact that we have seen. So what we're asking our governments to do, I am part of government at the federal level, and we have state governors, we have local government chairmen, and the government at that level, is to refocus on the basics. We've gone a lot to building infrastructure, which is very important. But delivery of water is such an essential need. And if we do some analysis on our population expansion, and we can get that data easily from our population is growing, and we have to keep delivering basic amenities. And water is the most important of all the other needs to survive. And if we don't do that, the supplies will be strained. There will be pressure on the existing supplies. This will lead to people then looking for alternative supplies, which then leads to infections, leads to deaths. And we're in that vicious cycle of looking for a medical response to something that is essentially not a medical issue. So we will work together. This is not abdicating responsibility. We want to work together with the Ministry of Water Resources, Agriculture, but really work with all aspects of government to find a holistic response to this. If we don't, we will have a bigger cholera outbreak next year and the year after. So my essential point this morning is let's work together across board, across society. There's also an education component to it, educating people on what we need to do ourselves in schools, in homes, how important it is to boil water. That if you look at water, it looks clean. Doesn't mean that it's clean. We have to boil it. If we can't boil it, the chlorination, basic, simple chlorination, get some chlorine, drop a few drops in your water. It really helps against cholera, especially. So there are some things we can do in the household, some we can do in our community, educate our children in schools, try and provide sanitation facilities in our schools. You come to a school sometimes, even private schools, you see classrooms for thousands of children, and you see one bathroom and toilet facility, often without running water. So insist that before the Ministry of Education gives approval to a school, that they have the hygiene facilities that they need to support the number of students they have in the school. So we need to come together as a society, raise awareness about what we can do, not delegate everything to government, but government has a big responsibility, and we will continue working together with our different government agencies that have some responsibility in this area. That's what we're trying to do now, and that's what the minister has asked us to do, and pull together our different colleagues to really push this up the agenda in Nigeria over the next few years.
Well, it's not an easy job on the hands of government, Dr. Hukasu, because, I mean, just as you said, the population is growing. Are our resources growing in this, at the same level? That's another matter altogether. But is there a role for the people in all of this? Let's take that on when we return from this break, Doctor. Please stay with us.
As at 8th August 2021, a total of 1,534 cases, including 75 deaths, have been reported from 25 local governments across the state. Of the reported cases, 67% are aged 15 years and above, while 3 cases were reported to be under 1. Of all reported suspected cases, 53% were found to be male. 140 samples have been collected so far, within 43 rapid diagnostic test positive, 2 culture positive. Funtua local government had the record of highest number of cases with 384, followed by Sabwa, who recorded 232, Kafur 215, Cherenchi 135, Kankara 71, and Jibia with 69 cases. In terms of mortality, Funtua also leads with 18. Followed by Cherenchi, who recorded 14 deaths, Jibia 11, Kankara 5, Sabwa and Rimi having 4 each.
Thanks for staying with us. Dr. Hikwazu, you spoke recently at a conference and where you said every week NCDC detects cases of yellow fever, Lassa fever, measles, and other infectious diseases that are endemic in Nigeria. And they also said that there is a case of monkeypox discovered in the U.S. with travel history from Nigeria. Now, I'm wondering, Doc, how are we even going to take all these on board while COVID-19 is still right there in our faces. Cholera is killing, and we also know that all of these diseases that you have mentioned as well also have case fatalities sometimes. Doc, you might be muted. Could you kindly unmute?
Sorry about that. You're absolutely right about that. And that's where we have to give credit to this government. You know, when we started with NCDC a few years ago, it was a tiny agency, a tiny workforce, a negligible budget. But I think the federal government of Nigeria really recognized the importance infectious diseases would play in our country into the future. With 200 million people living in this small space, that doesn't get any bigger, right? The more people in a certain space, the easier it is for infections to jump from one person to the other. The socio-economic realities that are ours are the tropics, the heat, the densely populated nature of our cities makes it inevitable almost that this was almost a perfect environment for infectious diseases to thrive. So what do we do in the response? We have to build up our defenses. Our defenses at the state level, but also our defenses at the federal government level. How do we do that? We do that by building strong institutions. So we've spent the last few years building up NCDC from a workforce of 70 in 2016 to over 500 at the moment. We've built up a national reference lab that should be the pride of the country. We've trained individuals, young, smart Nigerians that are able to do the surveillance, to detect, respond to these infections. So what we have done is build up the intellectual capacity to prevent, detect, and respond. What we now need to do is to not go beyond that, educate Nigerians on what they can do, and push the leadership. Our governments have so many different priorities, rightly so. We're struggling with insecurity, we're struggling with infrastructure, education. So sometimes it's hard for these issues to get up the political agenda. So we keep pushing them. And those messages are being heard. Health security is now recognized not only as a health issue, but as a national security issue. And that's rightly so. We've seen the impact the COVID had on our economy last year. So we have to keep pushing on these things. Some of them we can manage, right? A number of the diseases you mentioned are vaccine preventable diseases. So we need to push our routine immunization rates up. Our sister agency, the National Primary Healthcare Development Agency, is working very hard on this every single day. But mothers, citizens need to know why it's important to take their children for vaccination. We're just talking about cholera, right? Government needs to provide water, but people can provide soaps in their houses, bar soap in bathroom facilities, learn to wash their hands. So there's a lot that we can do as a society. But Ayo, I think the most important message is that our environment is a perfect environment. As a society, we must give it the importance it deserves, the prioritization it needs, and we will find solutions. We want to be at the heart of the solutions now, no longer just recipients of therapies to solve our problem. So at NCDC, we're building a strong workforce to lead on this response, not only today, but into the future for Nigeria.
Well, so we had hoped that part of the benefits that would accrue, if any at all, from our experience with COVID-19 was the fact that our sanitation was going to improve a great deal and the consciousness of people towards sanitation was going to improve. Sadly, we've seen that on a yearly basis, cholera is one of the diseases that we have to deal with. And when you look at the states listed which are affected by this disease, there are huge questions questions to be asked. I mean, some states, as I was saying earlier with my colleague Ayo, that some states, you can understand that those states could be vulnerable. For instance, Borno and perhaps Benue, where you have huge numbers of internally displaced people living together in camps. However, some other states, you have to ask, especially a place like the Federal Capital Territory affected by a disease, a preventable disease such as cholera. You have to ask huge questions as to if any benefits whatsoever have accrued to us from our awareness about sanitization and the purity of water and how we need to keep our environment and our hands clean. Have we really gained any benefits from this? Have we learned any lessons from the outbreak of COVID?
I think we have. I feel your frustration on the lack of on the speed of progress, right? Just yesterday, I was speaking to the Honorable Minister for the Federal Capital Territory. I could feel his pain and his own frustration at the number of cholera cases and deaths occurring at the FCT and his commitment to doing something about this. The FCT, people often think about it as just central business districts, Maitama, Socorro, and the places around the capital. But, FCT is far bigger than that. And within this capital territory, there are many portions of it where the circumstances are a lot worse than we find in the middle of the city. So what he's doing is trying to address this. In fact, his central message is that we must not be completely taken by COVID, and we must make sure that we respond to diseases that affect everyone in society. And he has assured me of his prioritization of the response to cholera by providing the facilities needed. However, Maupe, this is a marathon, right? It's not a sprint. So what happens almost every year is that we have this outbreak, is on TV shows, we're all interested, and then we all forget because other problems come in the path of the investments that need to be made. So what we're trying to do now, and this has been the mandate that Minister gave us, to make sure that we really call together the multiplicity of stakeholders involved in delivering what is needed to prevent water transmittable diseases, which cholera is the most important. But let's not give up. I know it's been a hard journey. It's hard to see citizens of Nigeria die from a disease. To be honest, many countries have not seen for decades, literally. Cholera, it should not be a challenge that we're faced with in a modern society in 2021. We have to get above this. And I think this has woken us up in Nigeria to that fact. And collectively, we need to find the political will, the energy as a population, the media as a critical stakeholder, a role player in this, to push and say, listen, it is completely unacceptable for 816 people confirmed this year to have died from cholera, a disease that is almost non-existent in many other countries in the world.
And so you have to ask, I mean, when it comes to the political will, I do know that a few years ago, we launched a program, a campaign against open defecation. We saw the billboards here in the Federal Capital Territory. Yes, I do acknowledge that indeed a lot of the health challenges we face, we mustn't address them like sprints. We must address them as a marathon. The question is, if we have seen the sustained energy and if we know the people responsible for the program, so is it just a general launch and then after that, we all go home? We all know that open defecation is still a thing right here in the Federal Capital Territory. And it's not even happening in the suburbs. Yes, it might be happening in the suburbs, but we see it happening right, approaching the heart of the city. There are huge questions as to whether we've really put our money where our mouth is. Dr. Ihekwazu,
yes,
can you hear me?
Address, right? One, open. Yeah, yes, I can. Are we back on?
Fantastic. We lost you for a bit. Please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So, so with open defecation, this is really a multi-pronged response. One key point I'd like to make is we don't actually need to wait till we have the perfect water and sanitation response that is, an ideal situation. We can build safe pit toilets in certain environments that is not ideal, but is better than just open defecation in the field. So there's a lot of education we need to deliver so that even if you say, listen, I have an industry manufacturing complex somewhere, it's not easy to get water supplied to that complex. Boreholes are difficult. What is the alternative? There are alternatives. And so we have to look at these alternatives and provide them. And secondly, very often, employers too are a problem. People build up companies, have offices, but don't really think about where their workers will, ease themselves. So there's an education component to this. Not everything should be left to government to do. Companies can take this up as their civic social responsibility and do some of these things for our societies. But really, there's no magic bullet out of this. This is not even an issue like COVID, where we say, okay, listen, we're going to get vaccines and vaccines will solve this problem. There wouldn't be a vaccination solution to this. So we will get back to the basics. We will have to get back to the basics of water, hygiene, soap, toilets, all these problems that societies have to solve as they develop. This is really what we have to focus on as a society. And, we're going into an election cycle in a year and a bit, right? We have to push. Nigerians need to know and ask the hard questions of the leaders that will come to them seeking their votes, right? And to push these agendas up. If they do so, we will find a government, and this government has invested a lot, opened up that campaign, and done its bit. But as we elect the new set of leaders, we will sustain the momentum built over the last few years so we can take this into the future and build on the progress we have made already and make sure that every year we're doing a little bit more to prevent the next outbreak. And so really the central point of this is there's no magic bullet. We have to invest on all parts of the response, on education, on facilities, on water, hygiene, sanitation, our schools, our churches, sustaining hand washing, and collectively with all the agencies, we will make progress. But this will only happen if citizens insist and keep this on the political agenda way beyond the outbreak that we're facing at the moment.
Well, look, the huge question for me is whether we're recording progress. Because we know that year in, year out, there are some diseases that are seasonal. Lassa fever, we know it will come in the dry season. Well, we hope it doesn't come this dry season, or we don't see the rate of fatalities that we have seen in the past. For cholera this year, it seems that we have seen a remarkable rate of fatalities than we would normally record. Can you confirm this? And if indeed it is true, is there anything that you would say is particularly responsible for this?
So yeah, cholera, at least in the Nigerian context, we see kind of what we call high seasons in a 3-4 year cycle. So in 2017-18, we had also a very bad year around a similar axis, started in Bauchi, went to Kano, so kind of that northwest axis. 3 years ago, 2017-18. And 3-4 years later, we're seeing a similar cycle happening. So we kind of know the cycles. What happens is, there's some level of passive immunity that builds up in those populations over a few years. And that's why when you do a cholera vaccination campaign, it's kind of the vaccines are only effective for about a 2-3 year cycle. So we understand the immunity cycle of cholera lasts for about 2-3 years. And then when immunity wanes and there's the reintroduction of this infection, you see another outbreak. 4 years ago, we had a big vaccination response in Borno State, focusing a lot on the IDP camps, which was very effective. This year, again, we've done a campaign, a limited campaign, vaccines and scarves for cholera, and effective only for a few years. So it's not a huge part of our health response, but we did use it to respond in Bauchi, specifically because of the intensity of transmission there at a point in time. But yes, it does happen in 3-4 year cycles. So, and that's a bit of a challenge because cholera, with this outbreak this year, the likelihood is that next year we won't have a big year. So, you know, begin to forget. So we will keep that is now going into the response that we have seen across government, state, federal, parastatals is sustained even when there are slower years of transmission of this virus.
Well, that's definitely something to keep in mind, because one might think that, oh, the following year when we don't see such an outbreak, oh, perhaps we're making progress. But if we keep in mind that this is something that could happen every 3 years, then maybe we will be able to make real progress in that regard. I wanted to quickly ask you about this Marburg virus, which is of concern to the WHO and has been discovered in Guinea. Is it something that is of great concern to the NCDC, considering that it has Ebola-like properties from what we hear?
Yes, Marburg, sorry, and I just called cholera as a virus. It's actually a bacteria. To Marburg, absolutely. So we are continuously on the watch out for Marburg and Ebola. Marburg and Ebola have very similar characteristics. And the very interesting and intriguing and worrying thing about Marburg in Guinea is that it's the first time this virus is being found in Guinea and in that extreme west of West Africa. So Ebola and Marburg are very intriguing that we haven't quite fully understood where it emerges from. So spontaneously you find a cluster of often deaths, you start looking for a cause, and it ends up to be this virus. So we're very aware, firstly, it tells us that we have to always be on our guard here. So we set up a risk analysis team yesterday, actually, evaluated the risk for Nigeria. It's low at the moment, but what we did is make sure that we have the facilities, the commodities to detect this if there were to be a suspect case. And of course, we're now watching out for travel. We're working with our colleagues in Port Health Services, looking at the travel history of individuals that are traveling. But the most important response to something like this is to control it at source. So we're also in communication with our colleagues in the West Africa Health Organization and the Africa Center for Disease Control to provide and offer whatever support we can to the colleagues on site, but to make sure that as a collective on the continent, beyond Nigeria, that we always are aware of risks and able to manage and mitigate this at the point where that risk is emerging from. And in this case, it's in Guinea, in West Africa.
Dr. Hekwazu, one other thing that concerns me, back to the endemic issues that you began with earlier, Lassa fever, yellow fever, measles, and other infectious diseases that are endemic in Nigeria. Is there a role for the people in these various communities? We are a communal people. We always like to be together and all of that. And here we are. The more we are together, it would seem, the more likely we infect each other. Is there a role for the people in all of this melee?
Yeah. So this is a very interesting question. If you look at the history of Western Europe, for instance, and the decline of infectious diseases in Western Europe, this was not really associated with any medical intervention. This happened passively as the standards of living improved over time, and people lived in smaller setups, the infrastructure improved, housing improved, water improved, sanitation improved, and almost a side effect of that was a reduction of the transmission of infectious disease. Now, we have a unique way of life in Nigeria, which we don't want to lose, largely. You're absolutely right. We do a lot together. We eat together. We celebrate together. And that comes with some risks. So as a society, we need to learn how to mitigate those risks. So whatever we are together, right? And if we're going to eat together, for instance, from the same plate of food, that there will always be the maybe oldest person in that group that says, listen, okay, now let's all go and wash our hands together as well, if that's what it will take, right? And we hold ourselves, we are much more educated about the risk factors around transmission. And I've said this on this show many times, not only at home, in our hospitals, schools, we need to learn to do the simple things while not losing those such beautiful aspects of our culture that brings us together. But right now, if it's our culture to have a big ceremony as a wedding or as a whatever ceremony that we're planning that pulls together thousands of people into a single enclosed space, the fact is that within the context of COVID, that will expose you and your guests to significant risks. So you have to mitigate those risks by limiting the number of people you're inviting, insisting on mask wearing, insist on a certain level of distancing, at least as we fight this biggest infectious disease threat of our lifetime. So there's a conflict between our culture at the moment and the threats that we face. But I think if there's a decision to be made between life and culture, I suspect that the decision should be obvious to most of us.
Well, there was something also, to take away from what you have said is that if infrastructure improves, the side effect, or rather the side benefit would be that some of these situations that we have on our hands would also come down. It would seem then that it's more, you said it earlier, it's less of a health or medical intervention that is required as opposed to political or policy or infrastructure. In conversations with the states, is there any possibility of a timeline being come up with anytime soon, so as to how often will be, or how frequently, how soon we'll have some of these infrastructure so that these risks might reduce? Dr. Hekwazu, okay, I think
yeah. So you asked about timelines.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, you asked about timelines. I think it's very difficult to offer development timelines for countries, states. It's very difficult and also a little bit beyond the scope of my responsibility. We contribute to that in different ways. Both building, even for infectious diseases, requires a certain level of investment in infrastructure, rightly so. We also provide advice to other aspects of government in terms of what they need to do to develop their infrastructure. And as we continue developing as a society, the impact will be similar to what has happened in the West, and which is why this really is a collective effort and needs to stay not only on top of the health agenda, but on top of the political agenda, not just for the next couple of years, for the next 10, 20 years.
Well, it would seem then that all the ministries, departments, and agencies in the health industry in Nigeria are collaborating. But then there is usually that question of funding. Is there a funding problem to taking on some of these issues from where you, from your perspective?
For the work that we do specifically, I must say we've been fairly well funded to respond to the COVID outbreak in the last 18 months. What we're now trying to do is really work out what level of funding is required for health security as part of a collective investment in the health sector moving forward. And I think there's an increasing recognition at the federal and state level that this is important. If we want to be able to detect these new viruses, to carry out the surveillance that we need to carry out, prevent spread through the focus on infection prevention and control, requires a certain level of investment, which costs money. But the other thing, too, is just investment in the health sector altogether. We budget plus minus 5% of our total budgetary allocations towards health at the federal level. That varies a lot at the state level. Anything from some states have gone over 10%, closer to 15%. Many are still even below 5%. So that's the first thing. Secondly is the effectiveness of the funds and the inclusion of other players, such as the private sector in the delivery of healthcare services. So we've seen a rapid expansion of high-end private sector health facilities over the last few years. We've also seen the National Health Insurance Scheme really pushing hard to expand the number of people that benefit from health insurance and therefore put in more resources into the sector. So in conclusion, the point I'm making is that it's not just to health, it is also
Oh dear. Well, I was just hoping that I'll be able to ask. Okay, well, you're back. My apologies for that. I just want to very, very quickly ask you. You must be concerned about the fact that the workforce in the health industry is also greatly depleted with the strike of the NERD. How is that affecting your work or our interventions in any way that you know?
So far, the impact has been minimal, but it will get worse as the strike persists, right? And I think there are very deep issues that are worth the discussions happening and have to be resolved. Many of these are long-standing issues and they need resolution. And I'm very glad that the Ministry of Health, both ministers, are so engaged in this problem, our National Assembly, to resolve it. But there's no doubt about it. You know, the level of vulnerability we have as a country because of the strike action will increase exponentially. Is that while the issues at stake for resident doctors are very important, we have an existential problem as a society, as a humanity, and that maybe the might consider that this point in time, and we can really resolve these issues outside of this period and hold on till we get ahead of.
Well, Dr. Ihekweazu, we can only wish you well in all of the things that you do for us in the country. Dr. Chikwe Ihekweazu is Director General, Nigeria Center for Disease Control, NCDC. Thank you so much for your time and your perspectives this morning. Sunrise Daily continues in a moment after these messages.